Blessed day to you. Thanks for joining me. My name is Nigel Daring. I am the author, the originator of the philosophy of Darinism, or Darinism, if you will. It's based on my book, Existence, God, Man, Society, and Nature, which you're seeing in the background, and which is available at Amazon.com. You can type in the name of the book. It'll come up, or you can type in my name, Nigel Daring, and you'll see 16 books come up, and that's one of the books that's there. Um, and so, what this philosophy is, it's an analysis of Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3, and correlating it to my analysis of reality, and basically claiming that those pages, Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3, what's there is a fair existence of, or an actual existence of reality, and we ought to pay attention to it. I have done 11 previous videos. I hope you'll check them out, because this one is actually building on them. So we're going to move on, but before that, I just want to apologize in advance, just in case it happens. Sometimes my computer does, for whatever reason, does skip slides while I'm in the middle of a thought, and it breaks that train of thought. And so, just in case it happens, just realize that it's not my fault, and if this presentation sort of becomes choppy, um, that well, it is choppy with me normally speaking, but just in case you have this abrupt break, it's not what I intended, and so I sort of have to compromise and sort of patch it up to make it sort of flow somewhat. Or sometimes I might be on one slide, and I'm talking, um, discussing points from the previous slide. That's because the computer switched it without me, um, without me volunteering for it to switch. Um, but anyway, let's move on. First, before I get into the review, I just want to get to what I, to this to these points here, so that it's, reinforce it from what I've said so far and discussed so far, and and just for you to realize, the first point is, insecurity. Insecurity is spiritual death. Okay, that's the death that God was talking about in the beginning, when he told Adam and Eve not to feed off the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The insecurity that they develop, that is death. That is spiritual death. If you're insecure, you're dead. You're dead inside. Even though you're breathing physically, that insecurity marks spiritual death. Insecurity is evil. It is the essence of evil. It's the root of evil. If you're insecure, you're going to be evil. You're by definition evil. It is a state of evil. When people are evil, they're insecure. It's their insecurity that produces evil. That's the root of evil. That is the distance that causes this distance from God. Okay, because you're made to be secure in yourself. So if you're insecure, that means you're at a distance from God, and so by virtue of that, you're evil. So insecurity is the roots of evil. It's the essence of it. Now, also, just as a word of advice, if you're feeling fear, if you're feeling fear inside of you, it means you're insecure. Okay? And if you're insecure, what it means also is that you're processing existence unnaturally. In a state of consciousness, you're not beholding reality naturally. You're not thinking of reality the way you're supposed to be thinking of it, which also means in a state of consciousness, you're living a lie. You have a false ego. You have a false definition of self. And it brings on insecurity. False definition of self brings on insecurity, and it brings on fear. So if you're in a state of fear, you're living a lie. You're processing reality unnaturally. You're not seeing reality as it's supposed to be. And in living that lie, you're not being your natural self. There's a natural state of being that you should be in, and once you're in that natural state of being, you will never feel fear. You'll never feel insecure. All right? Um, I just wanted to point that out because I think that might be helpful to a lot of people who sense this psychological deficiency of fear or of insecurity. They're connected. They're states of evil. They're states of being unnatural, of living a lie, of being dissociated from reality, of being dissociated from God, and existence, and the truth of existence, the natural order of existence. Okay, let's review from last time. Well, last time we said man's mentality dealing with the world um, comes from his own dealing with himself. As a spiritual creature, how he deals with himself spiritually and how he deals with his body. Because that's conditions the way he's going to deal with the world. It's his reference. It dictates how he's going to deal with the world outside. And so in that mentality, there's, because in his evil state he's insecure, and there's a loss of complacency in himself. He finds a loss of complacency also in the outside world, because at his root self, his nature, it is a part of nature, it's a part of God, it's a part of all reality. So as he's lost complacency in himself, which is nature, he's going to lose complacency in nature outside of there, the whole enterprise. Um, so that's, and that, there's also a sense of inadequacy in himself, because the reason why he's drifting from himself, he develops an insecurity because he develops this idea that he's not right, he's not perfect, he needs to be some other thing, something other than what God created him to be. And so there's a sense of inadequacy in himself, which translates to an inadequacy in nature. He doesn't feel adequate, being that doesn't feel nature as somehow adequate, as somehow perfect. God created it and said it's all good, but in his state of evil mind, he's looking at it that it is not good, because he's looking at himself also as not good at a fundamental level. Also, along with that comes feelings of superiority, right? That because his natural state, he views it as abominable, then he's viewing any distance away from that natural state as being superior, a superior state of being. So he develops this better than mentality, the state of superiority. Fear, which we spoke about before, as a part of insecurity, is insecurity he fears, because he's made his physical form the center of his being, and so because his whole identity is his body, he's going to fear for his flesh, the life of his flesh, because he's found life in flesh. And now he's worried about it. He's thinking nature is inadequate. It's not going to provide for him. So now in his interaction with nature, it is guided by that fear. It's fear of nature, that nature might harm him, because nature becomes some other. He's disconnected from nature. It's fear for his physical desires, that they might not be satisfied to sustain the life of flesh. So he has to control and corral nature to satisfy his needs. He has to make sure there is food. He's not going to sit around and have this trust that nature is going to produce, and he'll just get up and walk and just go get the fruits and the herbs of the field. Now with that loss of trust and that fear, he's going to make sure that he has food. He's going to assure it for himself. And there's this other aspect to it, is that there's this ego that he's approaching nature with, that because he wants, or his world outside of himself, because he wants to prove himself to be God and do what God does, which is to think for himself and do for himself. He's approaching nature with that sense of ego, that he's not allowing nature to just care for him and to provide for him. He's on this ego trip of that he has to do it for himself and care for and develop his own sense of independence, which is to divorce himself from nature's systems and rhythms, and create systems and rhythms for his own self. And we'll talk later how that leads to him developing a concept of time. Okay, so that's part of his mentality. All right, the fear complex and the ego. The fear and the ego goes together. Remember, I said before, the fear goes with the insecurity, which comes from this unnatural ego because of the natural processing of existence. All right, so that fear and ego goes in terms of addressing the world. It's unnatural ego. Man also, in terms of addressing the world around him, and in terms of addressing his fellow man, he becomes selfish because he sees himself as only his physical form. That is the entirety of his being. Before he sinned against God, he viewed himself as being a part of the whole order of nature. He was ingrained in order, given a place in it, connected to the tree of life that is feeding all existence. He's feeding off of it. He's a part of it. He's connected to God that is within all nature and a part of him, because God is himself. God is a part of himself, his fundamental identity. But with his selfishness, he disconnects himself from God for his own sense of ego trip, and in that disconnect is materializing that himself. The transition from God is because of this condition that he was presented with, which is physical form. And so the transition from God takes on a physical meaning. It becomes flesh automatically by that transition, by the condition that he's accepted. That flesh is his reality. And so it becomes defined by flesh, and he becomes selfish. He sees himself as divorced from everything else around him. And of course, with his divorce from himself and his scorn of his natural self and of nature, there's just this scorn of nature in general that is outside there. There's this despise and distrust of nature. He doesn't trust nature anymore. He doesn't trust nature to care for him, and he despises it on top of it. So he has no problem attacking it or seeing himself as being against nature, as man against nature. All right, and now the other thing to realize, that man, in materializing himself and becoming flesh, he desires flesh for food because he desires his own flesh for food. Spiritually, he's feeding off his flesh, and that becomes a reference for feeding off flesh in general. So the animals become meat unto him, become food, right? What God said was meat to him was really the fruits and the herbs of the field, basically the vegetables, right? But he's not living in that spiritual state anymore, in which God created him and intended him to be. He's living in a state of flesh, and desiring his flesh. He's feeding off the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is his own flesh, and that becomes reference for him feeding off meat. Okay? Now, with his scorn of nature and his distance from nature, right? With his scorn of nature and his distrust of nature, he loses any kind of compulsion, any kind of need to feel integrated or to integrate himself into nature and just be a victim of its natural systems, or just participate wholesomely in the natural rhythms of nature. What he desires, based upon his ego and his fear, is to distance himself from nature and create a world of his own, where his ego allows him to regulate it himself, to control it himself, because he's trying to be God and create a world of his own and think for himself. And also because out of necessity, because of his fear that also accompanies the ego. He has to create a world for himself and assure food for himself, make sure food is stored, make sure the food is farmed, and he's seen it come up himself, and he's watering it himself and taking care of the plants himself, and he's domesticating the animals himself, because using them to help him plow the land, using them for food, because they're meat to him also. All right, they're food to him also in the state of being. Also, I forgot to mention the state of being that he's in as a creature of flesh and desiring animals for food. It's not just that he's flesh and desiring them as flesh, but that he's dead. His state of being is death, and he can relate to death, killing and murdering those animals for his food, because that's death. He's in a state of death. He can relate to death. He can internalize death. Okay, feeding off the plants and the herbs, he's feeding off life. That's life, as God told him. Feed off life. Tree of life in spirit. Feed off life in the physical realm also. Right? He's eating the fruits. He's spitting out the seeds. The seeds are regenerating life. When he's dealing with the animals, he's killing and destroying their lives. There's no reproduction in that. Right? And it's feeding a state of death. The other aspect of meat for food is it's feeding his state of agony. He's in a state of agony, trying to distance himself from his very own being. And that's an agonizing state of reality that he's caught up in. And so, so he can relate to agony. That's his reality. So he can impose agony upon nature, upon the animals, and that's what he's doing. He's sort of feeding his agony, right? He imposes agony out there to feed agony inside of him. So he's reinforcing agony inside of him by feeding off these creatures, right? Which he was never meant to do. All right. Well, what are the effects of this kind of mentality? Or other effects. His fellow man becomes victimized, right? Because in this better than mentality, this sense of superiority, he's going to address his fellow man like that. His fellow man and woman. And the world that he creates also is going to have this psychology of better than, this better than mentality. So which explains rank order society. It better than. This better than mentality is fundamental to it. Okay? Rank order society in all reality is not necessary. Right? And it's not a superior state of existence to primal, primitive, or indigenous cultures who can live in nature and be at one with nature. It's what rank order society is. It's a world that develops off of man's insecurity and his scorn of nature and his ego and his fear, right? And so this world that he creates has that superiority and the scorn that he develops. It inheres his superiority and his sense of feelings of superiority and his scorn of nature. And it is also a world that, by virtue of his attitude towards himself, which is antagonistic, and he's alien to himself and at odds with himself, which is his fundamental self is God and nature, he ends up with an antagonistic relationship with the world around him, and he's alien to it. The world that he creates out of this evil psychology becomes a world divorced from nature and antagonistic to it, because now, instead of feeding into nature and the life of nature and the rhythms of nature, he's beating it down, or he's reconstructing it to suit his ego, to address his fear, right? And so he's constantly disrupting nature to satisfy himself and to feel like he's content, which he never really is, because as long as he maintains his ego, he's never going to be content. All right. Now, there is, let's get into this discussion proper. There's a population explosion that occurs when you have this transition to rank order society, right? Population explosion moving in terms of man moving from tribal primitive into this rank order civilized society. There's always a population explosion. And that what happens is man becomes more sexual, more carnal in these societies, because remember, at the root, what allows man to develop these societies is that he's on his ego trip. That's what he develops in real, or in his primal existence, primitive existence. He gets this ego, or capitalizes on this ego which Adam introduced, which is there in some primal form, but he capitalizes on it to develop civilized society. But the ego, by virtue of what it is um, an acceptance of flesh for reality. Okay, and by accepting flesh, he becomes more carnal. Because remember, I said before, once he gets into flesh, he discovers flesh. He discovers the desires of flesh, the lust of flesh. It was the lust of flesh that brought him into flesh, and so he becomes a carnal being, not a spiritual being, as he's supposed to be in the way that God made him, but he becomes a carnal being. His reality is his carnal form. In the way God made him, this carnal form was just supposed to be a shadow proper, which physical existence is just a shadow. But in his carnal mind, frame of mind, chasing ego through using his body, or through his body, then he becomes a carnal creature, because he's accepting the shadow of his being as real, to validate, to somehow validate this ego, right? Which by accepting this illusion as real, I mean, this ego then is really some unreal state of being, which it really is. It's an unreal state of existence that he's in, right? And he's using an illusion to live the psychotic state. And this is what the state that man has been in since he's been on earth, and it's more severe once he engages that path to civilized existence, and he's developing it a lot more, is that he's becoming more unreal, more psychotic, more divorced from reality, more divorced from nature and existence. All right. Well, how can we explain what happens? What this population explosion, this growth, right? It becomes nature, right? Man becomes physical. So what happens is, when man is connected to God, he's a spiritual creature, right? His body is at peace, because the body reflects the spirit. His desires are equable and balanced, right? And his body is at peace, right? With his dissociation from God, two things happen. For one, he gets this inner darkness because God disconnects him from the tree of life. Remember, the tree of life is providing him some food in spirit. It's feeding him at a spiritual level for his contentment, for his life. But when he accepts death, first of all, which is the first state of it is his insecurity, right? That's one state of death, which the insecurity of his ego. And then the other, in his presence of being as a spiritual, emotional being that needs to feed off the tree of life, that's another state of death, and that's a state of darkness. Now, that state of darkness, that spiritual state of darkness and death, becomes reflected in his flesh, in his physical form. So his body feels gloom, and is not happy within, meaning within his brain, the appropriate neurotransmitters are released then, or the endorphins, or all these things that gives pleasure within the brain. They aren't released. What happens in your brain basically reflects what happens in your spirit, unless your brain is actually physiologically um, impaired. But as long as it's healthy, it's going to reflect what's happening in your spirit. And what happens is that it's not the darkness of spirit that man gets by disassociation from God. It reflects in his brain, and how his brain is processing reality. It becomes and if his brain is dark, meaning that it's sensing gloom. It's not sensing the pleasure, that the natural sense of pleasure it's supposed to sense. Right? His whole body is going to be that, because the center of reality of human physical existence is in the brain. Now, naturally, people want to feel good. They don't want to feel this gloom inside. So what the evil mind does is start addressing the body itself, which is to address the inner gloom of the body by addressing the body itself. And so they never really address the spirit, which is okay. I apologize for that. That's one of those unintended skips. So I just want to complete the points of the last slide. Um, okay, so man does a lot. Most times, people don't address the gloom in spirit. They address the gloom in flesh, and the flesh is only reflecting the spirit. The body is only reflecting the spirit. So they get caught up into to dealing with the body, to stimulate the body, to get the pleasure, right? Get pleasure in the body, while ignoring the spirit. That's the root cause of the gloom in the flesh. Now, there's something else to realize, is that you're, once man dissociates from God and he becomes a physical creature, carnal creature, um, he notices his body. He does notice his bodies and his desires. They're more intense because his focus is upon them. That's one level of why they're more intense, right? Because the body is reflecting that um it's the whole idea is that focusing on something, it becomes more real to you, more intense to you. So his physical desires become more intense, more part of his focus, right? Um, so that focus on the body creates this more intense desires. The other thing is to realize, um, because the body reflects the spirit, and the more distance he gains from God, the more in flesh he becomes, the more intense his desires are going to be. Okay? Because that's another aspect of understanding why his physical desires become more intense. That once he starts distancing himself from God and start distancing himself more and more, which means he's becoming more and more in flesh, and his body is reflecting his distance more and more, those desires become more unbalanced, more intense, and he's focusing on them a lot more. So that entraps him a lot more, because he's focused on his flesh and his body a lot more. So the desires are more intense by that focus, and they're more intense by his distance, his increasing distance from God. All right? Now, in terms of the approach that man has, since man's mentality is not to give up the ego, because he's chasing this great ego for for greatness, for his personal greatness, right? Since he doesn't want to give up the ego, what he does in terms of the gloom that he's feeling within as a result, as an effect of this ego trip that he's on, what he does is turn to pleasuring the body, not looking within himself and think, you know what, I'm doing something wrong. I need to get back to my sense of self. I need to get back to God. I need to get back to spirit. I need to get back to truth, so that I can feel good. What? No, that's not what he's doing. He likes the ego. He's going after it, and the gloom that he's sensing in his flesh as a result of it, what he's going to do is address it by stimulating flesh, right? By getting a high off of flesh, which leads us into this slide in particular. He's studying. He knows his desires and these intense desires, right? And he knows his gloom inside. He studied it. He feels it. He understands it. If he has sex can relieve him. It gives him a high. It gives him the high. It makes him feel good physically. So it provides a source of a high. No, the problem with sex is it's not, it's an ephemeral thing. You have sex and it's over, but well, because the spirit was never addressed in the first place, once the high of the sex is over, then the gloom of the spirit returns. So you actually return. The physical desires are calmed, right, or relieved, but the gloom of the spirit returns, and it's reflected on the body. What happens then is that man then sort of develops a dependence on sex, right? Because he's not addressing his inner state of being. He's using the body to address, to stimulate, to get to be stimulate to stimulate it, to get the high. So he develops an addiction to sex. He keeps reverting to it over and over again. Develops a dependence on it, so that so that it gets him high to combat this lack of inner peace that he has while he's on this ego trip, while he's insecure, right? And so is the woman that then becomes an object of gratification. She doesn't assume her natural place as a creature of love, which she was intended to be, and of companionship. She starts becoming an object of gratification, along with sir, occupying a lower status with relationship to man. She becomes an object. She becomes objectified. He needs to use her to pleasure himself, to keep him high, to keep from this gloom, because the gloom returns once the sex is over, and in short order it's going to return, and his body is going to revert in reflection to the state, to the gloom, in reflection of what's going on in the spirit. So he keeps depending upon sex, upon the woman. And it's not just that he just objectifies her, he objectifies his body. The body is just a tool for him to get to this great sense of self, and it's a tool to be pleasure. It's a thing to be pleasured. It's so that he can keep himself high while he's on this ego trip. All right. So then there's this dependence, an addiction to dependence on sex to combat the gloom. There's addiction to sex, and this is what causes babies to be born. Lots of sex. So if man keeps depending on sex like that and keeps having sex like that, it's not that he's after babies being born. He's just after the high, and the babies being born becomes as a consequence. Well, what happens then is that you have an explosion in the population. There are more people being born in these civilized realities, that predicates itself upon the evil man in his dark state of being, in his state of dissociation from God. Just babies are being born. They inherit this psychology from their parents, and they themselves start performing as their parents do, and start depending upon sex, and start living in the flesh, and start living after the flesh, and start having more and more babies, and so forth and so on, and it just continues. So civilization becomes uncontrolled in its growth, because it's based on the psychologically deficient, out of control man. He's out of control, chasing this ego, which is putting him in flesh, and which is also darkening his mood in flesh, as in reflection of what's going on in spirit, and he habitually goes to sex to get him high, which then the effect of that is to have more babies being born, population exploding, and civilization just gets um, out of control, and it's this unbalanced entity that's growing, and growing and growing, and imposing itself on nature, because it's not actually fitting into the rhythms and systems of nature. It's antagonistic to the world around. Okay, so this is what happens with this dissociation from self and from God. Now, I just want to point out this generality in terms of addiction. It's not just sex. People turn to alcohol and drugs. They turn to food. They get addicted to food because these things stimulate, stimulate man. Brings pleasure. So that's why you have lots of seasoning and lots of um, things to accentuate the taste of the food. Taste becomes important. Nature has a taste to it, a natural flavor to the food that God made. The herbs and the vegetables, they have their natural flavoring. But with this thing of being high, there's extra flavoring. There's stuff to just, it's not just the eating, but the stimulating of the body to get the pleasure. This thing of pleasure in flesh, because man is flesh. He puts himself in flesh. Okay? Drugs to stimulate the body. Alcohol to escape the gloom. Things to knock man out so he doesn't think about his inner gloom or to feel the weight of it. Escapism. Gambling also. These are things that help man to get on this unnatural high. Right? To escape his gloom. And these are the consequences of dissociation from God. Alright. Okay, I just want to close out by reading the summary of the section I did on population explosion. Here we go. Man has always searched for the truth of his existence. Modern man has presented social scientists of various stripes with misleading concepts. One glaring falsehood commonly proposed is that the population explosion that occurred in civilized societies resulted from development in agriculture and domestication rather than from spiritual weakness and addictive behavior. Man is not really after truth, he is after his own truth. He wants to justify this illusory existence he has fashioned about some developed and developing state of being. He wants desperately to avoid acknowledging that his divine identity, constructed at Lucifer's behest, is farcical. Disillusionment would mean his admitting that he is evil, that he has been degenerating abominably, becoming an affront to God and nature. So social scientists will look for conditions out in the world that influenced man's development, quote unquote development, to prolong avoidance of confronting self and truth. They cannot find them because they do not exist. The civilized worlds man constructed radiated from spiritual degeneracy, the progressive corruption of internal psychological states. The truth that man has been looking for was told to him in the early chapters of Genesis. It stares him in the face. He just cannot bring himself to believe it. Okay, so that's a summary. The population explosion basically came off spiritual degeneracy, of addictive sexual conduct, of uncontrolled behavior that's germane to the development of civilization, because once they start developing, they never get to a point and stop there. They just start getting out of, they just develop uncontrollably, because they're at the root of it is the uncontrolled, unstable man in a psychological state of being. All right. We leave it there. I hope you'll check me out next time. Check out my other videos. I hope you'll check out check out other videos that I'll be doing, and check out previous videos. And be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Also, get the book Existence, God, Man, Society, and Nature, and you'll see where I'm coming from, and see where I'm fleshing out these ideas a lot more. And until next time, thanks for checking me out, and share this video. All right, then bye-bye.